Good morning again, everyone. It's Crab Feast weekend. You don't sound too excited about that. Hopefully the American Legion Post air conditioner will be working better than it is in here. You know, when I think of crabs and crab feasts, I often call to mind my favorite picture of Father Miller. And if you don't know what picture I'm talking about, you go on the website and look under history or Father Miller would. I don't know exactly where you have it, but it's on the website, I know that. And Father Miller is standing in the rectory dining room over a bushel of huge steamed crabs strewn across the table. And he's holding two of them in each of his hands, and he's sporting the biggest grin you ever saw. Father Miller loved crabs. Father Miller loved food. Father Miller loved to surround himself with food and family and friends. You know, this week we buried Donald Manna, who many of us knew as the Tasty Cake Man. Whenever Donald brought tasty cakes to share, he didn't just bring a few. He brought cases of them. And with them, he brought joy to so many people. And growing up in an Italian household, my mother taught me at an early age that if you're hosting an event and you have just enough, you don't have enough. Abundance is often a measure of hospitality for us. If you're entertaining guests, you want to make sure there's plenty to go around. Amen. Now, in the ancient world, hospitality was critical. Not so much as a matter of entertainment, but as a matter of necessity. If you want to follow along today, if you're taking notes in your homily journal, we're looking at Genesis 18, 1 to 10. And in that portion of the book of Genesis, we read the story of Abraham showing great hospitality to 3 visitors. Now, the reason hospitality was so important back then is that in that part of the country, the terrain and the climate were pretty tough and brutal on the people. Mamre, where Abraham is in the hill country, and it's rocky, and it's desert. It's near the desert and the wilderness. It's not far from the Dead Sea. So it would be very harsh climate. And in fact, Abraham has found a tree in this area, and that's where he pitches his tent because he needs the shade of the tree. And the book of Genesis tells us that while the day was growing hot, we can appreciate that right now, Abraham looked up and he saw 3 men standing near him. And when he saw them, he ran from the entrance of his tent to greet them. And bowing to the ground, he said, "Sir, if it please you, do not go on past your servant. Let some water be brought that you may bathe your feet and then rest under the tree. Now that you have come to your servant, let me bring you a little food that you may refresh yourselves. And afterward, you may go on your way." And what follows is actually a bit comical, because he says, "Let me bring you a little food." And he rushes and he tells Sarah Quick, get 3 measures of flour and make some bread. Now, the amount of flour that is, as it gets translated in the Old Testament, is nearly a half a bushel of flour.
Wow.
That's a lot of bread. Then he goes out and he finds a tender, choice steer. And he has that slaughtered and prepared. It's a whole animal.
Yeah.
Then he goes and he finds some curds and milk. Curds being a form of cheese, probably.
Right.
Abraham is preparing one big cheeseburger for his guests. Now, the other thing that's interesting is that if any of you know anything about the kosher laws, it's a big no-no to be serving meat and dairy at the same meal. Now, fortunately, God wouldn't hand over those rules until Moses shows up. So Abraham's clear right now. But the scene that's described is one of lots of activity and lots of generosity and lots of care and service being offered to the guests. And it's one that's echoed in the gospel story as well. We'll flip to Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42. And in this story, in the gospel, we know that Jesus has been on this long journey from Galilee to Jerusalem. And he too is traveling through the hill country of Judea. It's rocky and it's hot, and he has all of his disciples with him. And he now stops in to see Martha and Mary for some rest and refreshment. And St. Luke tells us that as they continued to their journey and he entered the village, a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary who sat beside the Lord at his feet, listening to him speak. Now, it's important to realize that there are 2 acts of hospitality occurring here. The one act which most of us would recognize, which is the serving of food. The second act, though, is Mary sitting and listening and being attentive to Jesus, the guest. But Luke tells us that Martha, burdened with much serving, as you can imagine, she's got to feed not just Jesus, but all of his disciples as well. So she comes to Jesus and says, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me by myself to do the serving? Tell her to help me." Anybody identifying with Martha right now? Yeah, I mean, obviously she believes that the hospitality of serving food and beverage is a little bit more important right now than sitting at Jesus' feet. So she actually anticipates that Jesus will agree with her by saying, "Tell Mary to help me." And Jesus' response is, dare I say, a bit disappointing. "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her." Now, you may not admit it right here in church, but I have heard people, one after another, be furious at Jesus' response. Sure, it's important to pay attention to your guests and listen to what they have to say, but feed them first. And then there'll be plenty of time to chat. Obviously, Jesus doesn't see it that way. And what Jesus is saying to Martha is that when you focus exclusively on all the material and the worldly things that have to be accomplished, that's what's going to make you worried and anxious, because those things are going to seem unending to you, and you're always going to be worried about whether there is enough to go around. But it's just as important to pay attention to the personal relationships of the people around you that you care and you love about. Because when you pay attention to that, and when you're focused on the love and care you have for each other, that's what's going to get you through everything else. You see, for us, hospitality tends to mean serving and offering and tending to people's material needs. And when we look at hospitality that way, we see it's the host who has something to give to the guest, and it's the guest who does all the receiving. But you see, for Jesus, true hospitality is our attentiveness and our listening and our loving the person among us. And when we see hospitality that way, it's not so much that the host is giving something to the guest. It's the realization that the guest has something to offer the host. Because of the wisdom and the love and the care that they have in their own story, the host can benefit from listening to the guest. And you see, in this case in particular, with Mary listening to the words of Jesus, the word of God, and her becoming his disciple, as indicated by the fact that she's sitting at his feet, which was an Old Testament image of discipleship, the disciple at the feet of the master. You see, she has chosen the better part, because as she has nourished her soul with the love that Jesus has to give, she is no longer anxious and worried about the things of the world. And that is the better part, and it will not be taken from her. You see, in true hospitality of one listening and being attentive, it's the host who benefits from the hospitality to the guest. And that gets reflected right back in the story of Abraham. Because after all of the attention and care he gives to his visitors, they say to him, if I can find it, they say to them, "We will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son." This is the blessing of the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham, that he would become the father of a great nation. And so ultimately, he too, as the host, is blessed by his hospitality to the guest. You see, from a faith perspective, hospitality is important because of the blessings that flow from the guest to the host when the host pays attention and cares for the guest. It's what led the author of the letter to the Hebrews to say, "Do not neglect hospitality, for through it some have unknowingly entertained angels." What a tragedy, then, how our society today, under the leadership of Donald Trump and his cohorts, has become so inhospitable to others. Our government's policy of separating immigrant families and detaining them in caged facilities, all as a way of discouraging and punishing them for coming to our country in search of a better life, contradicts everything the Bible stands for. Trump's hate-filled rhetoric toward racial, ethnic, and religious minorities establishes hostility as the norm, not hospitality. In fact, the EEOC regards the specific words, "go back from where you came from," words that Trump directed at 4 congresswomen of color last week. The EEOC regards those words as evidence, when said in the workplace, of a hostile environment towards minorities. And this kind of hostility is not simply supported by people in the political arena. People who call themselves Christians buy into it as well. Now, people of faith are rightly concerned by our Western culture's increasing secularism. But certain Christians, and even among them Catholics, have become outright xenophobic, jingoistic, and vitriolic. If you want me to define those terms, I just like the play and the rhythm of it. Xenophobic, fear of the foreigner. Jingoistic, nativism at its worst. And vitriolic, outright mean and violent. That is what many Christians today are buying into. You see, they're afraid that in welcoming the stranger into their midst, that will cause them to lose what they have, even to lose their own culture. You see, they think there's only so much to go around. And when you're focused on all the worldly things, then you become worried and anxious and inhospitable. They are people of little faith. Because Jesus tells us that when we are hospitable to one another, when we offer ourselves not only in service to another, but in attentiveness to their story and their experience, we actually receive a blessing from the other. Jesus tells us that when we choose the better part, we are the ones who benefit from tending to the stranger. And Jesus tells us that when we choose the better part, it will not be taken from us. Despite what the political and religious demagogues of our day are saying, there is plenty to go around. Hospitality to others doesn't threaten to take what we already have. In fact, true hospitality blesses us in abundance. But only if we believe. As a people of faith, as a Catholic church, as a parish of St. Bernardine, we are always challenged to welcome the stranger among us. Whether it's in the needy who come to us, the neighbors who live by us, the youth who look up to us, the families who bring their children to us. We must always strive to put others first and to care for their needs by listening and being attentive to them. And we need to call out our leaders and our colleagues and our neighbors when they value hostility over hospitality. As people of faith, we must never neglect hospitality, for through it, some have unknowingly entertained angels. Amen.